The Japanese women prisoners, faces pale from exhaustion, braced themselves for what they had been taught to expect from their captors: cruelty, brutality, and humiliation. But as the American cowboys approached, something entirely unexpected happened. A medic, dressed in worn denim, squatted down and gently cleaned a wound that had been festering for days. His touch was kind, not cold. His eyes were not filled with contempt, but concern. She had been prepared to meet death or dishonor, but instead she found herself met with kindness. For these women, raised on a steady diet of propaganda about the barbaric Americans, the shock was devastating. The promise of torture and suffering was shattered in an instant. Instead of fists or jeers, there was mercy. Instead of pain, there was care. For days they had been marched through the wilderness, starving and exhausted, their bodies aching from the relentless journey. Each step had brought them closer to what they feared most: American captivity. From the moment they had been captured, they were told only of the horrors that awaited them. They had heard stories of the cruel, barbaric Americans, of violent guards, of degrading interrogations, and of the cruelty that would be inflicted on them in ways far worse than death. Now, standing on the edge of what was meant to be their nightmare, the women could not help but brace for the unimaginable suffering. Yet, as they were ushered into the camp, the unexpected began to unfold. The sight before them was far from what they had been told to expect. They were met by soldiers, but not the fierce, snarling enemies they had imagined. Instead, the men standing before them wore denim uniforms, their faces a mix of curiosity and fatigue, but above all, kindness. These were American soldiers, yes, but they were cowboys. Many had never seen a Japanese woman before, let alone treated one as a fellow human being. They stood for the most part as unarmed as their prisoners, their rifles slung casually by their sides. The overwhelming feeling was one of calm, not cruelty. The women, confused and disoriented, could not reconcile what they had been taught with what they were seeing. They had expected to be treated as subhuman, yet the cowboys seemed to offer them respect. For the first time in days, they were offered water, not as a mockery, but as a genuine gesture of care. When a woman stumbled, her arm weak from hunger and fever, a cowboy stepped forward, his hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her to her feet. He did not scold her, as their own officers might have. He did not laugh at her weakness. He merely offered her a small smile and a steadying arm. For a moment the prisoner hesitated, unable to accept the unexpected compassion. She feared it might be a trap, a false kindness before the real torment began. But it wasn't. This was not what they had been led to believe. The medical tent was where their first true shock took place. Inside, the women were lined up, some still trembling from the ordeal, others faint with exhaustion. A cowboy medic, tall and rough around the edges, examined each of them with an efficiency and tenderness that defied everything they had been told about the enemy. He cleaned wounds with practiced care, speaking to them in a language they couldn't fully understand, but his tone was gentle, not harsh. He moved with purpose, as if this were an ordinary day for him, tending to the wounds of his comrades. The women could not grasp the reality before them. This man, dressed in a simple outfit that reeked of hard work and the dusty plains of the West, was treating them as though they were human beings. As the days passed, the women began to grapple with their emotions. They could no longer deny the kindness they had been shown, but their hearts resisted, unable to reconcile their emotions with the reality of their situation. Could the enemy really be this merciful? Or was this all part of a greater deception, a plan to break them down mentally before the true horrors began? Their struggle was not just with their captors, but with their own minds and hearts. Would they ever accept that their own government had lied to them? Would they ever forgive themselves for this betrayal? These were questions they could not yet answer, but what they did know was that their world was shifting beneath them, and they were powerless to stop it. The cowboys, though unaware of the deep psychological warfare they were waging, continued to treat their prisoners with dignity. In their eyes, they were doing what any soldier should do: protect and heal. But for the women, every act of kindness, every touch of care was a reminder of how completely their expectations had been shattered. It was a slow, painful process, a journey that was just beginning, one where the answers to these questions would only come in time. Despite their captors' acts of kindness, the Japanese women could not fully accept what was being offered. They were torn between survival and honor, between their deep-rooted beliefs and the overwhelming urge to live. Each time a cowboy medic approached, offering a drink of water or the opportunity to rest, the walls the women had built around themselves grew even higher. It wasn't simply distrust. It was a visceral reaction, a refusal to acknowledge the humanity of the men who stood before them. The enemy, they had been taught, was barbaric, and to accept anything from them was to betray everything they had been raised to believe. The battle for their souls was beginning, and they did not yet understand how deep the war within them would go. One woman, her face gaunt from hunger and exhaustion, watched as the medic offered her a canteen. Her throat was parched, and the thought of the cool water was almost unbearable. Yet she hesitated. The images of her homeland, of her family fighting on, of the emperor's image burned into her mind, made the very idea of drinking from the hands of the enemy seem unthinkable. Could she betray them all for the sake of survival? In her hesitation, a sharp sense of shame stung her chest. To drink would be to acknowledge that she was no longer the soldier she had once been, strong and unyielding. It would mean giving up the last shreds of her identity and accepting a different reality, one where kindness existed even in the heart of her enemies. The dissonance between their survival instincts and their ingrained sense of duty became sharper each day. Some of the women began to recognize the logic in accepting aid. Survival, after all, was paramount. To resist it would mean death. Slowly, very slowly, some women began to acknowledge this truth. They began to understand that perhaps their loyalty to a dying empire would not save them. Perhaps there was more to life than honor and sacrifice. Perhaps survival itself was an act of rebellion. Yet others could not reconcile this with their beliefs. They could not see past the loyalty to their nation that had shaped them for so long. The internal conflict felt like a knife to the heart, tearing at their sense of identity with every passing moment. One woman, a nurse by training, stared down at the clean bandage offered by the cowboy medic. She had been trained to care for others, to heal wounds, but to be healed by the enemy felt like a betrayal of everything she had ever known. Yet, as the days went by, the exhaustion from her injuries took its toll. The infection was spreading, and the pain was unbearable. In a moment of vulnerability, her arms shaking, she accepted the bandage. It was not a decision made lightly. It was a surrender of sorts. She took the bandage, hands trembling, afraid of what it meant. But the very act of accepting it felt like a quiet unraveling of the armor she had spent years building around her heart. She would never have imagined that it would come to this. A small act of kindness would break through the walls she had fought so hard to build. The hesitation in her acceptance was palpable. The fear that it was a trick still lingered in her heart. What if this kindness was a deception? What if it was a method of breaking them down before the true cruelty began? She could not shake the fear that this might be the calm before the storm. And yet she allowed herself to accept the care, if only for a moment. The pain in her chest, both physical and emotional, was overwhelming. She could not understand why these men were showing her compassion, but in her deepest part she knew that her survival depended on this moment of trust. The process was slow, painful, and filled with doubt. It was not just their bodies that needed healing, but their hearts and minds, too. Only time would reveal whether they could ever fully reconcile with the truth of their experiences in captivity, a truth that was much harder to face than the horrors they had anticipated. The days began to blur together as the women slowly adapted to their new lives in captivity. With each passing meal, each medical treatment, and each passing moment of interaction with their captors, the walls they had spent so long constructing around their hearts started to crack. It wasn't a dramatic change, but rather a gradual softening, an unraveling of the rigid barriers that had been built by years of indoctrination. The small, quiet acts of kindness began to chip away at the emotional armor that had held them prisoner for so long. The first time they were served a warm meal, many of them felt their stomachs twist with a mix of hunger and disbelief. The food was more than just nourishment. It was an affirmation that they were no longer forgotten, no longer just casualties of war. The warm broth, rich with vegetables and meat, was almost too much for their bodies to process after the near starvation they had endured. It was as though they had been transported to another world, one where their needs were actually met, not ignored. For days they had subsisted on scraps and the occasional sip of dirty water. To now be offered a meal that was both abundant and hot felt like a luxury they could hardly comprehend. Yet with every bite, the truth became more undeniable. Their captors were not the monsters they had been told to expect. The clean clothes were another shock. For so long they had worn the same tattered uniforms, their bodies covered in dirt and sweat, their skin caked with the remnants of battles long lost. Now they were given fresh uniforms, crisp and washed, which felt almost like an insult. How could they accept these gifts of comfort from the very people they had been taught to hate? It was one thing to eat, to survive, but to wear clean clothes. It felt like a breach of the very code they had sworn to uphold. But even in their reluctance, they couldn't deny the physical relief. There was a strange comfort in the softness of the fabric, a comfort they had forgotten existed, and yet it was not easy to accept. Each act of kindness from the soldiers was another stone thrown into the carefully constructed dam of their beliefs. It wasn't that the prisoners were ungrateful. It was that the kindness felt like a betrayal of everything they had ever known. How could they accept the mercy offered to them without it making them feel as though they were abandoning their loyalty, their honor, and their families back home? Guilt, confusion, and shame began to swirl inside them like a storm. The psychological war had begun in earnest. Every day the women faced a new battle, not just for survival, but for their very identities. The simple acts of kindness they had received, a meal, a clean bandage, a conversation with a guard, shattered their perception of the world. The very foundation of their beliefs had been built on the premise that the enemy was less than human, that their suffering was deserved, and that their loyalty to their emperor was paramount. But now those beliefs were crumbling under the weight of their experiences. Each moment of doubt, each moment of hesitation was a painful reminder that the war they had been fighting in their minds was not just about survival. It was about understanding who they were, who their captors were, and what the true cost of war really was. The women felt lost between the war they had been taught to fight and the new, more complicated reality they were now forced to confront. The small acts of kindness that had begun as small cracks in their emotional armor were now spreading, slowly unraveling their convictions. And as the days passed, the emotional weight of that realization became harder to ignore. They were no longer just prisoners. They were people being treated with respect, kindness, and care. It was an unsettling thought, but it was the truth. And the women, though hesitant and filled with confusion, could not escape it. The threshold had been crossed. The walls were starting to fall. The days that followed were filled with the slow process of recovery. The women, their bodies weakened by starvation and neglect, began to regain their strength as they were fed regular meals, clothed in clean uniforms, and treated for the wounds that had festered during their captivity. Their physical transformation was undeniable. The hunger that had gnawed at their insides for so long began to subside, and the aching weakness that had plagued them faded with each passing day. But while their bodies healed, their emotional wounds remained raw, more complex than any physical ailment they had endured. Despite the kindness they had received, the women found it increasingly difficult to let go of the detachment they had carried for so long. The emotional scars they had accumulated during the brutal years of war, the constant fear, the relentless propaganda, and the years of indoctrination were not so easily erased. Each meal served, each moment of rest, was a reminder of their vulnerability, and with vulnerability came the gnawing fear of betrayal. Could they truly trust these men, their captors, who seemed to offer only kindness? Were they being lured into a false sense of security, only to be struck down once their guard was completely lowered? It was an internal battle, a war within their hearts that no amount of food or medical aid could heal. As the days wore on, the physical healing continued, but the emotional turmoil escalated. The Cowboys, unknowingly, became both healers and tormentors. They provided not only medical care but small gestures of kindness that, though intended as simple acts of decency, only added to the women's internal conflict. A quiet conversation over a cup of tea, a gentle hand on the shoulder after a long day, a laugh shared during an unguarded moment. Each of these was like an unexpected wound, a reminder that they were being treated with compassion, not cruelty. The contradictions were maddening. How could they reconcile the humanity of their captors with the hatred they had been taught to feel? How could they embrace the very thing they had been raised to reject? Still, the cracks deepened. The simplest interactions, like a guard offering a warm drink, became moments of tension and revelation. With each shared conversation, the women saw that the soldiers were not the faceless, inhuman beings they had been warned about. They had families. They laughed. They even seemed to care for the women's well-being. These realizations were both unsettling and comforting. What had once been so clearly divided, the us versus them, now seemed to blur into something more complex. And yet, as their bodies healed, the emotional questions grew louder, echoing in their minds as loudly as the screams of battle had. Could surrender ever be honorable? Was it possible that the things they had been taught to believe were lies? The sense of duty to their emperor, their country, began to feel like a weight, a heavy burden that threatened to crush them. Had their loyalty to Japan been misplaced? And what of their heritage? Was accepting kindness from the enemy, from these cowboys, a betrayal of their ancestors? Each moment of kindness from the Americans seemed to be a personal assault on their sense of identity. To be treated like a human by the enemy was to admit that they had been wrong all along. Each small act of trust, however hesitant or fleeting, began to add up. A cup of tea, a bandage, a shared laugh. These moments, though tiny, marked the beginning of a transformation that would change these women forever. But the struggle was far from over. Their emotional healing would take much longer than their physical recovery, and the internal battle between duty and survival would continue to rage within them for years to come. As the days stretched into weeks, the emotional toll deepened. The women's internal battles grew more intense, more urgent. With each passing day, the evidence mounted that their captors were not the monsters they had been taught to fear. The cowboys, who had once seemed like mere soldiers, distant and unfamiliar, were now people who had shown them genuine care and respect. In many ways, the truth of their humanity was more painful than the violence they had feared. It was easier to believe in monsters, in demons who existed to torment them. But the reality was more complex, and that complexity was harder to confront. For many of the women, the hardest struggle was with the weight of honor, an honor that had been drilled into them since childhood. The concepts of loyalty and duty to the emperor, the family, and the nation were not mere ideals, but principles that had guided every action, every thought, every sacrifice. To accept the kindness of the enemy was to betray that honor, to turn away from the very essence of who they had been. This was not just a moral dilemma, it was an existential crisis. The cognitive dissonance they experienced was profound. Some women continued to cling to their traditional notions of honor and shame, even as the weight of those ideals crushed them under the realization that survival depended on accepting what they had been taught to reject. To accept kindness, to show vulnerability, was not only a breach of military protocol, but a denial of everything that had defined their lives. Could they betray their emperor's teachings for the sake of their own lives? Could they live with themselves if they allowed mercy from their captors to replace the rigid code they had spent their entire lives upholding? For many, this was a question that gnawed at them in the darkest hours of the night, when the silence of captivity pressed heavily upon their hearts. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the cultural gap between the women and their captors remained an unbridgeable chasm for many. The Japanese women's inability to fully comprehend American compassion only highlighted the divide that existed between them and their captors. The gestures of kindness that felt so foreign to them, offering food, speaking softly, treating them as equals, created confusion, not comfort. In their world, kindness was something to be earned, not given freely. To accept it without merit, without justification, felt like a betrayal of everything they had known. The cultural clash extended beyond these small acts of mercy. There was also the physical divide, the space between the women and the Americans, the barbed wire and guard towers that separated them both literally and symbolically. The distance between them was not only one of nationality, but also of worldview. The Americans operated from a fundamentally different set of values, one where compassion was not a weakness, but a virtue. To the Japanese women, this was incomprehensible. They had been raised to believe that only through hardship, sacrifice, and suffering could one truly prove their worth. But here, in the hands of their captors, they were being shown an entirely new definition of what it meant to be human. As the women began to embrace this new understanding of themselves, they began to question not only their captors, but the very values that had defined their lives before the war. Could surrender, as they had been told, truly be dishonorable? Could mercy be seen as strength rather than weakness? These questions, though uncomfortable, were the beginning of a new chapter in their journey, a journey of self-discovery and acceptance that would change them forever. In the heart of the camp, amid the barbed wire and guards, the women began to see not only their captors' humanity, but their own. And in that realization, they took their first steps toward true freedom. But that freedom came at a steep price. As the weeks passed, the emotional weight of their situation grew unbearably heavy. Each day brought a new conflict, a new layer of complexity to the battle raging inside them. It was no longer just about surviving captivity. It was about confronting everything they had been taught, everything they had believed. The kindness of the Americans, once an unsettling contradiction, now felt like an insurmountable wall, a barrier between them and the lives they had once known. Each small act of mercy, every ounce of comfort given to them, deepened their sense of guilt and confusion. They had been taught to hate their captors, to view them as monsters, as brutal forces bent on the destruction of Japan. But these men who fed them, treated their wounds, and spoke to them with respect, could not fit into the mold they had been given. The cognitive dissonance was suffocating, and with it came the dark realization that everything they had once held true might have been a lie. The trauma of war weighed heavily on them, more so than any physical wound. It had shattered their sense of self, their understanding of the world, and the very foundation of their beliefs. The brutality of the battles they had fought in, the horrors they had witnessed, seemed almost bearable compared to this emotional war they were now fighting within themselves. The memories of their families, mothers, fathers, children, all of whom they had left behind in the rubble of a broken nation, haunted them like ghosts, reminding them of the immense sacrifices they had made for the sake of honor and loyalty. How could they reconcile those sacrifices with the reality of the kindness they were now being shown? To accept that kindness would mean abandoning everything they had known. It felt like a betrayal, not only to their country, but to their families, and to the very ideals that had defined their existence. Some women clung fiercely to the ideology that had shaped their lives, rejecting the kindness of the Americans as nothing more than a trick, a psychological tactic meant to break their spirits. They saw each gesture of compassion as part of a larger plan to disarm them, to make them compliant before the final blow came. They could not, would not, allow themselves to be deceived. They turned away from the gifts of mercy, refusing to accept food, medical care, or even basic comfort. To do so would mean yielding to the enemy, and they were determined to fight until the very end. These women found solace in their defiance, in the idea that they could still maintain some semblance of control over their fate, even if that control meant enduring suffering. The internal conflict reached its peak when the women were forced to confront the deeper implications of their circumstances, the truth of their situation, that they were prisoners, that the war was lost, that their country was in ruins, could no longer be ignored. They had been conditioned to believe that surrender was dishonorable, that mercy from the enemy was a sign of weakness. But now, in the midst of captivity, they were being shown a new way of thinking, a new world view that was founded on compassion and equality. To embrace that world view meant rejecting the one they had known, a world view built on duty and sacrifice, on suffering for the sake of honor. The emotional climax of their journey came when they were forced to make a choice. Would they continue to cling to the broken system they had been raised in, a system that had led them to this point of destruction? Or would they embrace a new way of thinking, one based on the simple truth that mercy and compassion were not weaknesses, but strengths? It was not an easy choice. The weight of their past, the weight of their duty was too much to bear. But in the end, the women began to see that survival, true survival, was not about honor or ideology. It was about accepting the humanity of others, and in doing so, accepting their own. The ideological war inside them was not yet over, but the first steps had been taken. The women, battered and broken by the conflict, had started to see the possibility of healing. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with difficulty, but for the first time in months, they began to feel the faint stirrings of hope. They had crossed the darkest part of the journey, and in the distance they could see the faintest glimmer of light. As the days passed in captivity, the emotional distance that had once kept the women separated from their captors began to fade. Slowly, they started to acknowledge the kindness they had received not as a weakness, but as a lifeline. What had once been seen as a threat now appeared to be an essential part of their survival. The harsh lessons of the past, the ones that had taught them to resist kindness from the enemy, to view compassion as a weapon of manipulation, no longer held sway. In their place, something new began to take root, the understanding that kindness, even from their captors, was not only possible but necessary. The women, who had once viewed their situation through the narrow lens of hatred and suspicion, now saw the world in broader, more compassionate terms. Reconciliation was a slow process, one that took time to cultivate in their hearts. Many of the women struggled with the cognitive dissonance of accepting their captors' kindness while still holding on to the nationalistic ideals that had once defined their identities. But over time, they began to see that the mercy they were shown was not a betrayal of their nation or their emperor. In fact, it was a lifeline that allowed them to survive, both physically and emotionally. To resist that kindness was to resist life itself. They had come to understand that survival wasn't just about enduring hardship. It was about accepting help, about opening themselves up to the humanity of others. The American cowboys, once seen as distant enemies, now appeared as complex, multifaceted individuals who were capable of both strength and gentleness. They had not only fed and clothed the women, but had also offered something far more valuable: understanding. The women began to recognize that these men were not so different from themselves. They, too, had families, had suffered losses, had endured hardships. The roles of enemy and victim began to blur, replaced by a mutual recognition of humanity. The women had always viewed the war as a black-and-white conflict, with clearly defined sides. But now they were seeing the shades of gray in between, the humanity that transcended national borders. Forging new connections was perhaps the most unexpected result of this transformation. The women, who had once regarded their captors with suspicion, now found themselves forming tentative friendships with them. They exchanged stories, shared meals, and sometimes even laughed together. It was a strange new world, one where the lines between enemy and ally were no longer clear. The shared experience of captivity, the vulnerability of being prisoners in a foreign land, created a bond that transcended the roles they had once played. No longer were they just captors and captives, they were simply people, trying to survive in a world that had changed irrevocably. The lessons they learned in captivity would stay with them forever. The women would never forget the kindness of their captors, nor would they forget the internal transformation that had taken place within them. They had gone from seeing the world through a lens of hatred and fear to seeing it through a lens of understanding and empathy. The change was not just in their circumstances, but in their hearts, and as they moved forward, they carried with them the knowledge that survival was not just about enduring hardship, but about embracing the humanity of others, no matter who they were. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time they could see a way forward, a way that did not involve the destruction of their ideals, but rather the evolution of those ideals into something more inclusive, more compassionate. They had learned to accept not only the kindness of their captors, but also the kindness they could offer themselves. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, they felt ready to face it. As the war wound down and the women were finally repatriated, the return to Japan was not the triumphant homecoming they had once imagined. They had been prisoners, yes, but their captivity had transformed them in ways they could not have foreseen. The kindness they had experienced in the American camps had forever altered their view of the world, of their captors, and, most importantly, of themselves. Now, standing on the shores of their homeland, the women felt an overwhelming mixture of relief and sorrow. There was no parade, no celebration. Instead, they were met by a country shattered by war, a country whose very foundation had been broken. Japan was no longer the nation they had left behind. It was a land of ruins, of grief, and of lost hope. The streets were lined with people who, like the women, had suffered immense losses. The faces of the civilians were hollow, their eyes clouded with fatigue and sorrow. There were no cheers, no sense of victory in the air, only the stifling silence of a nation left to pick up the pieces of its former self. The women felt like strangers in their own land. The return they had once imagined, filled with pride and the knowledge that they had given everything for their country, was now tainted by the scars of what they had endured. They had hoped to come home as heroes, but they were instead confronted with the raw reality of the aftermath of war. And in their hearts, they knew that the war they had fought in was not the war they had returned to. Their minds were filled with the memories of the kindness they had been shown in captivity. The men who had once seemed like distant, faceless enemies had turned out to be human, capable of mercy and compassion. The prisoners now carried these memories of warmth with them, and it was hard to explain to the people around them, the family, the friends, the government officials, how they could feel anything but a sense of betrayal when they returned to a country that seemed so far removed from the kindness they had experienced. Japan had always been black and white, an honorable nation, a proud people, and an enemy to be vanquished. But now they could no longer see things in those terms. The women had changed, and the world they returned to felt unfamiliar, almost alien in its rigidity. In the quiet of their homes, the women felt the weight of their transformation. They were no longer the same people who had left for war. They had seen and experienced things that had changed them at a fundamental level. The mercy and kindness they had been shown in captivity could not be forgotten. But how could they reconcile those lessons with the expectations of a country that demanded loyalty above all else? How could they explain that the enemy they had been taught to hate was capable of showing them the very compassion they had never expected? The women now found themselves standing at a crossroads, torn between the country they had returned to and the people they had once believed were their enemies. Their transformation was not one that could be easily explained or understood. It was an internal journey, one that had changed the very fabric of their identities. And as they navigated the world that awaited them, they struggled to reconcile their new world view with the expectations of the world they had left behind. As their journey continued, the women would have to grapple with the lasting effects of their captivity. Their transformation was not complete. It would take time and many more moments of introspection before they fully understood the scope of the change that had taken place within them. But for now, they had returned home, not as heroes, but as women forever changed by the mercy of their captors. If you're enjoying this story, please like the video and leave a comment below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful stories. As time passed, the lasting effects of their experiences in American captivity began to unfold. The women found themselves living in a world where the shadows of their past still lingered, but they had come to understand that their journey had transformed them in ways that no one, not even they, could fully comprehend. The war had left scars, both visible and invisible, and those scars would stay with them forever. But amidst the trauma, there was also a deep sense of dignity, a recognition of the strength they had gained through their experiences. They had been treated with compassion in a time when cruelty was expected, and that mercy had become a part of their essence. It shaped the way they interacted with others, how they saw the world, and, most profoundly, how they saw themselves. The women who had once been so sure of their identity as soldiers, as victims of a war they had not chosen, now carried with them the knowledge that they were more than just prisoners of war or daughters of a fallen empire. Their captivity had become a crucible, a place where their understanding of humanity had been tested and redefined. They had learned to see beyond the labels of enemy and victim, and, in doing so, had rediscovered their own humanity. They had been forced to confront the darkest parts of war, the cruelty, the loss, the suffering, but they had also discovered the unexpected light that could shine even in the darkest places. The kindness they had received had taught them that humanity was not defined by nationality, rank, or allegiance, but by the simple acts of care and mercy that connected people on a deeper, more fundamental level. For many of the women, this lesson would become the guiding force of the rest of their lives. They would carry the memory of their captors' kindness with them long after they had returned to Japan. In their homes, in their communities, they would speak of what they had learned, of the simple truths that had emerged from their time in captivity. They had seen the world through a lens of fear and hatred for so long, but now they could see beyond that, recognizing the shared humanity in everyone they encountered. The women who had once recoiled at the idea of surrendering to an enemy now understood that survival was not about physical endurance alone. It was about embracing the humanity of others, accepting help when it was offered, and recognizing that mercy could be as powerful a force as any weapon. As the years went by, the memory of kindness transcended time. It was not a fleeting memory, but a foundational part of their lives. The lessons of mercy, of compassion, became part of the fabric of their existence. They passed those lessons on to their families, to their children, to the next generation. In the quiet moments when they sat with their loved ones, they would speak of what they had learned in captivity, the lessons they had carried with them back to Japan. They would remind others that even in the darkest times, there was room for kindness, and in that kindness there was strength. The women had learned this truth in the most painful of ways, but they had learned it all the same, and now they shared it with those around them, creating a legacy of compassion that would outlast the war and its wounds. The end of the war was not just the end of an era, but the beginning of something new for these women. They carried with them the lessons of their journey, the knowledge that compassion could heal the deepest wounds. The war had shaped them, but it was their response to it, their ability to embrace kindness, even in the most trying circumstances, that would shape the rest of their lives. Their journey was one of pain, but also of profound transformation, a transformation that would resonate through the years to come. As the years passed, the memories of their time in captivity remained vivid, etched into the women's minds as much as the scars of war. In quiet moments, when the bustle of daily life gave way to solitude, they would reflect on the time they had spent as prisoners of war. The memories were complex, filled with both anguish and unexpected moments of grace. The Cowboys, once seen as distant enemies, were now, in their minds, figures of compassion who had shown them kindness when they had expected nothing but cruelty. For some, those memories were easy to revisit, but for others, the memories were more difficult to face. How could they reconcile the mercy of their captors with the pain they had experienced during the war? How could they reconcile their changing view of humanity with the brutal realities of what they had been taught to believe? But as time passed, they began to understand that the transformation they had undergone was profound. It wasn't just their beliefs that had shifted, it was their very understanding of who they were. The women had gone from seeing themselves as victims of war, as loyal soldiers fighting for a cause, to seeing themselves as human beings capable of feeling compassion and receiving mercy. Their identity had been reshaped in captivity, not just by their experiences, but by the kindness they had been shown. It was the kind of kindness they had never expected to receive from their enemies, and yet it had become one of the most important lessons they had ever learned. The cowboys' unexpected compassion had shattered their preconceptions and, in doing so, had given them the chance to rebuild themselves as people who could understand and offer mercy in return. Revisiting those memories was a quiet reckoning. The women who had endured so much in captivity now began to see those moments of kindness not as anomalies, but as defining experiences that had helped shape their new world view. In the faces of their captors, they no longer saw just soldiers in uniform. They saw human beings just as flawed, just as capable of kindness as the women themselves. In those early days of captivity, it had been hard to understand that the cowboys were not evil, that their acts of mercy were not tricks or weaknesses. But over time, the women came to see that those acts of mercy had not only been life-saving, but had also set in motion a shift in their hearts. The mercy they had received was not a momentary gift, but a foundation upon which they had begun to rebuild their understanding of humanity. In the end, the story of these women is a testament to the transformative power of kindness. What began as a brutal captivity had ended in an unexpected form of liberation, not from physical shackles, but from the chains of hatred and misunderstanding that had once defined their lives. The cowboys, their unexpected saviors, had taught them the greatest lesson of all, that mercy, even in the darkest of times, can change the course of history, can change hearts, and can, ultimately, change the world. Did you find this story moving? Please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from, and how did this story impact you? We appreciate your support and look forward to hearing from you.